brought into France a little bit by Merleau-Ponty, he turned that into a theory of differentiation, which it had not really done. And he was also a marvelous synthesist. He brought together ideas from the big, in America we consider the big three, even though France and Germany don't think this way. Americans are obsessed with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim. And Bourdieu was very good at taking this relational idea of how we study class from Marx. That these things are fundamentally relational. You can't understand one aspect of culture without other aspects of culture and without the relations of those with more and less culture. In the same way that to a Marxist, you can't understand capital as a neutral resource, as a set of relations. He was great at taking these ideas of differentiation of spheres from Max Weber and retelling that in a very eloquent way. And he was great at taking these ideas of categorization from Durkheim and Durkheimians, trying to take the ideas that Durkheim used when he was explaining how the Australians developed the first cognitive systems in his speculative anthropology, and saying that those hold true for us. We also have these ways, these socially arbitrary ways of dividing up the world that become real through practice. And so that's another thing that Bourdieu was, I think, very good at, was trying to come up with a way of understanding human behavior that did not make implausible assumptions about the cognitive components of action, that people were rational, that they knew what they were doing. So we use the word practice sometimes. There are different ways people use this. For Bourdieu, practice means the kind of unconsciously skillful behavior that human organisms can have in the institutional world that they themselves have made. Bourdieu would like to speak of an ontological complicity between how we're set up, our habitus, which means our whole way of being, and the order that we are in, because we've internalized that. And he gets this in what I think is really truly absolutely his best work, Distinction, which is in many ways a sociological attempt to revise Kant's critique of judgment, which explains how there can be that ontological complicity between ourselves and the world, how we can make judgments when we can't prove them, but there's a certain rightness to it, when we know that something is in shockingly bad taste. Kant's explanation is one that takes us to universalism and a world in which over time we'll all agree about matters of taste, in a free cosmopolitan society. And Bourdieu's is one in which it's the opposite. We can never agree because taste is about domination. Taste is a way of excluding, of humiliating, of reinforcing inequality. So with that, I wanted to throw it open into discussion and see what we want to talk about. And I understand that I just put the distinction stuff up for the required reading, but a lot of you will have read other bits of Bourdieu, and it is fine for this one. But I usually don't want people to bring in stuff that not everyone's read. But with a Bourdieu for culture, I think it's totally appropriate. And then, so we want to have a discussion, but I want to reserve some time at the end to talk about some of the post-Bourdieuian arguments, how it's been brought into the sociology of culture, that will lead us to some of the stuff we're going to look at in a couple of weeks with Peterson in particular.
This is just a quick point, but you made the point that France and Germany doesn't consider the big three so much.
Yeah.
So what is there?
Well, so here first, I feel free. Anyone can correct me who knows better, but Daniel Silver at Toronto has been actually studying this and writing in this. So this is not me talking. This is me citing Silver. Oh, and Silver is one of Terry's students. He argues that most places we see a national bias, not this, and that the Marx, Weber, Durkheim thing really comes from the work that Parsons did to try to get around Americans, to make a new lineage for that cut off his rivals by saying that they weren't important, they didn't really exist. And so he's emphasizing Weber and Durkheim trying to bring in Pareto, an economist, and in the 60s, the radical kids want to kick out the bourgeois economists and bring in Marx. So Marx is the late entrance here. But then it does stabilize, seems to stabilize in the 1970s, whereas in France, to the extent that they are reading folks disproportionately, they're not necessarily reading a classical tradition outside of French classics. Now, it doesn't mean they're not reading Americans. Actually, in the 1970s, Parsons was, I don't know about France, but in Germany, Parsons was the #1 cited person in Germany. But what they weren't doing is having a disciplinary canon that brought, these there weren't non-German classics. But onto Bourdieu, Young Yu.
You can continue.
No.
Actually, I have questions mainly about theory, but I have a question about methodology for a long time. Is that I'm thinking about the concept of field, and when we are trying to measure some part of field, I think Bourdieu was trying to use some kind of PCA things, principal component things, to make like a two-dimensional kind of figure here. But I'm also thinking like, I think I have seen somebody else say like Bourdieu, they're not like social network kind of thing. But I think in some parts, I'm trying to think about like network itself could be some kind of measure of field. Like if you're doing network, you're doing some kind of layout. It's actually something like projection. Was it projecting to the field? Is not. Is it like a feasible kind of approach or not?
Okay, so let me first back up for other folks. So Pierre Bourdieu has this idea of studying fields, and one of the things he loved doing was portraying them on paper. Now, Bourdieu's argument was that most fields have a three-dimensional structure. And so when he's talking about fields, he's usually talking about places where there are people who are making something. We can call them fields of production. Distinction is unusual, and this is not about producers, it's about consumers, really. And so here we're looking at social space. But social space tends to have, says Bourdieu, a homology to the field. So Bourdieu's argument is that, and he has a weird way of doing this. So he has one dimension being this total volume of capital. And then in social space, the distinction is really between those who have cultural capital. Bourdieu puts them on the left because those are the good people like us, versus those who have more economic capital. So this is a funny way of doing it. We would think usually that you'd have just two dimensions, economic and cultural, but he likes it this way, and it helps him with his idea that so people like us, who he's writing for, are the dominated fraction of the dominant class. And these are our rivals, our foes, those with more money than brains. We do not like them. They're the trouble with the world. Now, there's a third dimension, which is trajectory, but
we halfway close some of the windows just so it's not quite so small. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Halfway. Okay.
So trajectory is hard to draw here, but what it means is that two people may occupy the same place, but it's really different. And I can tell you this is true. It's really different when one of you's on the way down and the other's on the way up, And so Bourdieu notices that. Anyway, so Bourdieu describes most of the fields that he's interested in, most of the cultural fields, in similar terms. Although what he often does is he describes one of these poles as being those who are more oriented to the inherent lot. Now, when it comes to a cultural field, right? So there's like the autonomous logic of the field, like painting for other painters, and then there's the heteronymous logic where you paint for money. I am in no way endorsing this, but this is the way Bourdieu argues and he tries to position people. So what he often does is he just draws stuff and tells you, like, this is the field of publishing, you know, so Flaubert is here, you know, blah, 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 blah. But for some of his other work, he uses data, and he does data analysis to position people here. Now, it's worth actually spending a little bit of time thinking about this. Bourdieu's conception is fundamentally relational, and he's true to this kind of relational conception. He wants to put people in a space, but not simply a space where we reduce people's people's complexity for the mere purpose of simplification, the way we might if we were going to say, let's put them in a space where one dimension is their income and another is their education. Bourdieu wants them to have something relational. He uses a technique called correspondence analysis, which is very closely related to principal components, type factor analysis, but it was really big in France, and there's it's beautiful. It became spun out into what's called geometric data analysis, really a mathematically beautiful way of thinking. But first, you have to know, like, that distinction is filled with those pictures like that. The space of lifestyles. Well, okay. Like where wines are, you know, yogurt, all these things. Actually, these are not plots from a technique, a mathematical technique. These are like, you know, like what do they, there's a word for docudramas that's like based on a true story. These are like based on a correspondence analysis, but Bourdieu totally moved stuff around the way he wanted, and for not only for purposes of legibility, but just because I think he just felt like he could do whatever he wanted. So he sometimes fakes the data, basically, a little bit, a little bit. But what he's doing, he is trying to do, is to position things. The way this works is that two things, like if we were looking at wines and occupations, two wines are going to be similar in their position in this space if they are consumed by people with similar occupations, and two occupations are similar if they are the people have the similar consumption habits. So that's the basic idea. And so what Yang Yu is saying is like, but what about a network? Wouldn't a network be a way of positioning fields? And indeed, in organizational research, there's been a lot of use of networks as a way of making fields. And part of it is that in organizational theory, this idea of field predated the importation of Bourdieu. So this was an older idea, and they have an idea of an organizational field, and they're thinking in network terms. The problem with taking it for culture has been that for lots and lots of cultural phenomena, we don't have direct ties between the people we want to position in the field. So a writer doesn't necessarily write to other writers. So the correspondence analysis thing makes more sense. Two writers are similar if they have similar readers. Two readers are similar if they read similar writers, right? But there are some cases in which people have been using network type analyses to look at fields. And part of this comes from the fact that there are these lots of new computer databases that have network structure. So I'm just going to tell two that are really interesting. So one kind of work uses collaboration. So the Internet Movie Database is really a rich source of collaboration data and can allow you to map out, for example, the field of directors, where directors are similar if they have ties to similar cameramen, similar editors, similar leading actors and stuff like that. There's also a lot of studies of music collaboration, because some people play on others' albums and stuff like that. There was, does MySpace still exist? MySpace was a really nice computer platform for musicians that allowed them to link to each other. And so Daniel Silver and Monica Lee Hi, Sudan. I have a great paper making the field of music via MySpace and understanding where genres are. You can see that people, what genres bridge to other genres and that you can collaborate across them and which you can't. So if you are interested in doing a kind of field analysis, absolutely, there are all sorts of really interesting ways in which networks can be used, especially because correspondence analysis is a purely descriptive technique. What you can put on the page are the first two dimensions of a very high dimensional solution. You can't always find much in those first two dimensions, right? So it works well for survey data that's very small. If you have a really big data set, correspondence analysis can't visualize it, but you can use network data, and there are remarkably, I mean, they're an art form, but there are algorithms that are really good at putting high dimensional spaces into an order, like the Tisney algorithm, for example. This really has been used by network. People are trying to get a sense of a field with a really high dimensional space. Pierre?
Just on that note, so like, what about orientation? Would a network be able to capture that? Because like the usefulness of this sort of field is that you can have an orientation at the top and the bottom and the left and the right, and you can think through that. But a network is that kind of amorphous. You can train it anyway.
It's true for this also. The positions are arbitrary, and Bourdieu twists them so that he is on the left. He and his friends. Like I'm not kidding you. Like, he literally, like, you'll get this plot, and you can put it any way. They're all equally true. But he'll make sure there's one. His book Homo Academicus is a study of academics, and like he's there, and like you can be goddamn sure he's gonna twist that thing so that he's on the left.
Is there a way for doing that in networks too, or?
Yeah, it's called taking it and turning it. I mean, technically, it's called a Procrustes transformations. There are ways of mathematically doing it, but you're allowed to say which way is north. In that kind of world.
Can I ask again about like what is the top of this?
Okay, so capital. So Bourdieu likes to use this word capital to mean the resources that can be used to achieve, success in some field, dominance in some field. It's largely a placeholder for a real analysis. There's nothing very intelligent in the tautology that the people who get to be the best poets have the most poet capital or whatever, right? In the social space, it's not as vacuous because what he means by total capital is like how much money you have and how much education you have. Cultural capital isn't just education, that's not the most important part, but it often turns into that both for the Americans who were studying it, but also sometimes for Bourdieu himself, very focused on the educational system as this way of reproducing class domination. Mike?
Yeah, I have a question which I think is not really related to this scheme, but it's about culture. So I just want to clarify because I'm not sure if I understood it correctly. When he's talking about culture, I think he's really trying to make this argument that all culture is kind of fake. So it's like a game, and everyone understands that it's a game, and he makes such examples as like, like left-wing newspapers and right-wing newspapers. So all of them know the rules of the game, all of them know what to expect from each other, and I think that, of course, in this kind of explanation, there is no place for subjectivity, and there is no place for an idea that some people might actually like something, like some kind of fashion, like some kind of like newspapers, and can really think a particular way, not to pretend that they think, but really think. So, and am I understand correctly that his explanation would be that, okay, this is just like over-determined, and that's why it is what it is?
Max, you want to
I have a quote from Jeffrey Alexander that in his strong program essay, he was talking about Bourdieu. Bourdieu's cultural content is arbitrary and without import. All that is important for the dominant group is to have their cultural codes embraced as legitimate. Culture provides strategic resource for actors rather than a text that shapes the world in meaningful ways.
Yes, so that is the reading of the hostile to Bourdieu. So Bourdieu himself would say, and I think correctly, no. I'm not saying that you don't really like it. I'm saying you do really like it. That's the thing, is that it's not a code that you decode. That would be if you were conscious. But the whole reason to explore taste is that your reactions are immediate ones. They are reactions of taste. You like it. You don't like it. You see a garden gnome in someone's yard and you're like, ooh, that's so tacky. Like, I can't believe it. You're not thinking like, here's a great way that I can make that person feel bad and keep my status as a professor. And when asked, like, well, what about you? What do you like? He'd say, like, I like the things that my theory says I should like. Like, I'm right here. I like that stuff. And he really does like it. He loves he loves music. He loves art and stuff like that. And he would say he does it. But he would absolutely say that it's overdetermined in the sense that, like, only with random variations if he wouldn't say he should free himself from where he is and like stuff that's in a different place. No.
He brought a 3-year-old child of his, and he held him up and said, Bourdieu, Bourdieu, Bourdieu. He was teaching him some words to speak.
So here's the thing I think that is that's not only is it so Alexander's technically wrong here, and distinction is beautiful, but somewhat underplays its hand because like everyone in France at this time, they're not structuralists. They're all trying to distance themselves from Lévi-Strauss because of his scientism, right? And so Bourdieu's very conscious that the French academic field is divided between the Sartreans and the Lévi-Straussians, and his big thing is always he wants to be both. He wants to be take the best of both, right? That's his big thing. There's this, also like, and then in America, it's like that's divided between the objectivists and the subjectivists. Objectivists are the stratification researchers who grind at stuff. The subjectivists are the people in California who wonder if reality is real, and he's going to bring that together too. Well, he very much like Lévi-Strauss has a sense that there is an inherent emotional meaning to certain kinds of sensory experiences. So wine, okay? Wine is a great example for Bourdieu. So in France, this is in his France, and it's not this simple, but this is his basic argument. Working class people, they like thick, sweet red wines. Clerks like white wines, and the professionals like red wines, but not the red wines that the working class likes. They like very dry and complex red wines, okay? Now, and I hate wine, so like this is, this is not me talking, this is just what people say, right? You can, but I have tasted wine, right? I know it. Sweet wine tastes thicker than a really dry wine, right? So here, jeez, I should have gotten this right, because there's champion chomper. So, like, here's his example of like working class dining is the guy the champion chomper who is in a food eating contest, right? There's nothing more non-upper class than participating in a quantity contest, who can eat the most food as opposed to the best food, right? So the working class body, says Bourdieu, is this big, thick body for big, thick jobs, and when that big thick body drinks wine, it wants a treat because it's been working all day, and wine should be a treat, and sweet things are a treat, and thickness is fine. Now the clerks, they have thin bodies. They're like, we don't want to be, we're not farmers anymore. We want to drink wine that's thin like us, but they can't afford the really best wine, so they're like, white wine is good. That's thin. It's not like it's not like you're a damn farmer. Yeah, it's cool and refreshing, but the professionals can really understand these wines and their complexity and appreciate that. They don't want just some kind of like pissy old white wine that any clerk can drink, right? So the thing is, they're actually tasting in the wines themselves. The complexity of the professional's mentality is there in the wine. You're like, oh, I think I'll be somewhat amused at the presumption of this wine. So that's why I think the Alexander argument is wrong, that there's actually there are mappings, Levi-Straussian mappings of the qualities. That the thickness in the wine is mirrored in the hardiness of many of the things that the working class in France, according to Bourdieu, likes. The complex, so we have all of these binary oppositions, which Alexander, as we'll see, also takes from Levi-Strauss, these binary oppositions that align with class. So working class is to upper class, as simple is to complex, as thick is to thin, as heavy is to light, et cetera, et cetera. So there is a logic there. It's a beautiful argument in the abstract. The data do not work that well for it, especially when you leave 1950s, 1960s France. There's good data for some of it for France, not even then and there. It becomes a little bit harder later. But I actually think, I would say the real thing, it turns out it's not that Bourdieu was wrong, it's that he was analyzing a cultural system as it was exploding. It's just that system has collapsed. There is no high culture anymore, basically. So that sense of opposition has kind of gone. So sorry, Pierre, I know you had something.
Oh, yeah, mine wasn't about pace, it was about the capital thing that you mentioned. I think so that's when like Bourdieu really started off, is like people read Bourdieu and so he started coming up with 100 different types of capitals. Like even in the special issue that you quoted, like one of the papers in that issue was like about cosmopolitan capital.
Yeah.
And Bourdieu himself goes beyond just the 3 year, like sometimes you'll add like symbolic capital or something like that. And I was just kind of like, and sometimes it's just, instead that some types of capital will get talked about in many different ways, like cultural capital is like omnivorousness, blah, blah, blah. Like, so my question is, how do we get to, like, we have these 3 capitals, they kind of make sense. How do we know that those exhaust the types of capital that we could talk about and that they're like sound ways to talk about it?
Yeah.
And like, how do we actually like assess like the validity of like types of capitals?
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so I think, first let me be a little clearer. There's 3 dimensions in social space, and those often are mirrored in 3 dimensions in a field, but that's not the same thing as a capital. Every field does have its own capital, and that does mean that you can expect a endless series of trivial papers saying that there's a truck driving capital. And actually, there's a distinction between interstate long-haul truck driving capital and domestic short-haul truck driving capital. And actually, there's a difference between the truck capital when you own your truck and when you don't own your truck, right? And the whole thing is like all of those things may be true, but they're not worth saying, right? Something's wrong there. That's one of the things that I think Bourdieu really understood, that he was going to give people a hammer that would allow them to go around and hammer everything, and that was going to be great, and it really was great. He had a big school because people knew what to do, and he gave them lots of silly Latin terms that they could use that would make it sound like they'd said something really remarkable. So instead of saying like, I found that like people people who can stay up all night are better, people in the dance marathon, like in dance marathons, they'll say like, they're in dance marathoning, there's a specific enjeu that is pursued, and it is the libido dancialis or whatever, and you develop a habitus dancialis and, a capital, a special cap, right? It's totally trivial, totally tautological. And there was a time when this was really painful. I think the nice thing is that the sociology of culture, as we are going to talk about, focused on this issue of like, is there really a high culture? Are upper status people more likely to have a highbrow culture or not? And that led to this work on omnivorousness, which changed, I think, our understanding of these dynamics. So yes, so there are still going to be papers about this capital and that capital, and they're usually not going to be that interesting. But I don't think we should throw out the idea of looking at fields just because you can do stuff that's really trivial. Like sometimes it's really interesting if you're going to act, instead of just saying like, I'm looking at this field and as its capital, I'll just name it, to try to position people, right? And so we see lots of really interesting studies where you represent, whether formally or informally, the dispersion and organization, because that's what sociologists are good at. We're good at studying organization. Enzo, did you?
Yeah, I have a question about the relation between social space and fields, because when we have data, we can almost create any field and say this is a field because we projected correspondence analysis. And I'm wondering, like, in Bourdieu's idea, any field is kind of coherent, and it seems that it's just the reproduction of the social space, but then you have the social space and fields. And I'm wondering if there is if it's really a parallel between the social space and fields, and if there is so much coherence between them. And because many people come up with many different fields, and then you have this coherence, but at the same time we don't know which fields are the most important, and then you have subfields and then sub-subfields, and it's a kind of mess, and anyone can have their fields, and so we don't know the relations between all the different fields, and we don't necessarily know also the relation between the social space and all these fields.
It was your narrow question, and the simple answer is this: Paris and the provinces dichotomy. In terms of the place or the geography is to classify Paris and the rest, whereas the mayors come from the rest of France, especially from the south, places like Avignon, Aix-en-Provence, Montpellier, that have super active cultural 1 month activities and so forth. We have a national conference, and the mayors from outside Paris say, you Parisians just, you write some laws and we just ignore them. We do it the way it works better. And the growth of France in the last 50, 60 years has been in the south and parts of the west, whereas the Paris and further north has been relatively declining in population as more of the French have moved to the south. And so, but some people have worked on this. Maxime Geoffrey has studied Marseille and Avignon, and the main collaborator of Bourdieu and Passeron for the first several books, but especially the key book where their perspective was articulated, which John didn't, at least when I stepped out for a second, you didn't really talk about, but their simple version of the same story, which, I mean, John gave you a much more, this year, a more multi-causal, and that is, I can't disagree with anything you've said. It's been wonderful. But nevertheless, behind that, when you ask a question such as how do you get from different types of capitalists and that, read his text more carefully within distinction, and then it goes back to let's say the Bourdieu-Passeron book, which is the dominating and the dominated, and explicitly in different ways he did say, and they both signed it at the time, the people at the top and the people at the bottom don't change. And so when I say don't change, a big question which critics have then asked is there no adult learning? Do we never change our views from what we learned as kids under our parents? And Bourdieu's logical answer is no. You follow, I mean, your father's occupation explains that you are a peasant from the provinces. And so you will always think and drink fat wine. Whereas Laurent Fleury or Benzacri, take a look at these are people who wanted to work on culture, who read Bourdieu at the beginning, who said, I want to build on something like this. And as they got into it, they said, hey, Bourdieu is leaving a lot of stuff out. And or put differently, often in the distinction book, he will discuss 15 kinds of culture, or 15 kinds of capital, perhaps, something of that sort. But then he would say, but what really drives the process is the dominated and the dominant, and the two classes. And so if we go back to the Bourdieu-Passeron book, basically is stated in terms of social stratification, as it's termed within sociology, and what it leaves out is what is heavily stressed in the people who work on this is what's called social mobility. That is, if you're born as a peasant, or you're born as, your father was his father was a postman. He wasn't a peasant; he was a postman. So basically. The bottom line is how much is there nobody rising up? He himself went to school locally. He then went to the top lycée, sort of high school, to prepare for the top grandes écoles. So he did well there. He then got into the top school, called the École Normale Supérieure, to be a professor. And he then, at the end of his career, he was at the Collège de France. He was he couldn't be in higher status in terms of classic academic kinds of career. He did a lot of social mobility, but he denied it in his bottom line, if you will. Linking it to Berkeley, Berkeley has had multiple time periods. There was a big change in the 60s. In the early 60s, there were people like Art Stinchcomb, Marty Lipset, Nathan Glazer, plus the Parsons people. In the late 60s, things got more and more. So Lipset would be standing on tops of cars and arguing with the student movements. Nathan Glazer wrote this up in the New York Review of Books. So we, from a distance, we could read about what was happening right then. By the late 60s, early 70s, Lipset left, Stinchcomb left, and they came to Harvard and Chicago, and Berkeley became more radically identified. And so this is I don't know, what year did you start grad school?
1987.
1987. Okay, so this was 20 years before that. Okay, so Berkeley had been that way for some time. But basically, if we look at the years when Bourdieu and Passeron published their book, which I looked this up to look at some other things that were going on in Berkeley, Bourdieu and Passeron was published in 1970. Okay, a book which when I think I read it in grad school, was published in 1959, and it was by two people at Berkeley who were called Bendix and Lipset, and their book was called Social Mobility in Industrial Society. Quote, this is on the University of California Press blurb about the book, which said, where else but in America captains of industry are fond of saying, could a penniless immigrant like Andrew Carnegie achieve so much? ? Then, any place that has reached the same stage of industrial development is the answer implicit in the book Social Mobility. The authors conclude somewhat surprisingly that there is not noticeably easier to pull oneself up by the bootstraps in the land of opportunity, the U.S., than it is in a number of other countries. France and the U.S. were very similar. So in that sense, This was published in 1959, and so when I read this and saw the data, and they also talk about it a lot. The politics and the ideology, the discussions in France is much more about class. Americans, at least the American style, is to say, just work harder and you'll go up. Whereas Bourdieu says the total opposite. So in that sense, and yet the data then show the U.S. and France are about the same. Same thing when we talked a little bit a couple of weeks ago, Philip Converse, about the political ideology. Same kind of thing. When he published that we've got lots of the people 8% of people have really a sharp and clear ideology. 92% can't really tell the difference between whether you support unions or not. And they ended beginning and the end of the same questionnaire. They reversed themselves. Okay, so then Converse went to France. He wrote a 500-page book and found basically France was the same. So in that sense, be careful about the people who write the books who tell a sharp and clear story.
Yeah, I think that's it's sort of like, is the glass half empty or half full, right? So Americans would describe, industrial societies are basically mobile, but there's still some stickiness of class. Whereas Bourdieu's like, industrial societies are basically static, but there's some there's some change and stuff like that, and that allows, I think, his conception allows a strong answer to this question of homology. The problem that we have is that Bourdieu changed his ideas about this over the course of his life while insisting that he hadn't and writing down that he hadn't, which meant that it's been really hard for people to sort out what's going on here. So in his earlier work, he does seem to be saying that the homology comes because we are all located in social space. And so even if a cultural field is only drawing from people here, yet there's going to be a tendency of homology because the people most interested in the money are going to get the people most interested in the money here. Stuff like that. And I don't know whether it all makes sense, but in some of the middle period stuff, he's suggesting that kind of homology. It makes sense if you think that we all have a certain way of being, which Bourdieu calls habitus, which is an idea he takes and then denies. He takes it from Durkheim's nephew Marcel Mauss, claiming to find it somewhere outside of France, which is a very typical French move. So habitus meaning, like, you're just way of being, but it's the thing that explains those regularities. Why, when you see a garden gnome, you think it's not cute, it's just tasteless. Why, when you see furniture that's sort of uncomfortable, you think that's cool, as opposed to a comfy chair. That's Bourdieu talking to his readers. The problem is that first Bourdieu later tries to, he doesn't want anything to be disprovable. He knows that people like Terry are out there and they're going to say you got stuff wrong. So he starts trying to make his system unfalsifiable. And one of the things he starts to talk about is this idea that actually we have more than one habitus, which I don't know if it makes any sense. It makes the system a little bit more immune to certain kinds of disproof, but then the question of homology becomes more confusing. Why would you expect a homology? Bourdieu becomes less interested in homology at that time. The more narrow cultural fields will have this general homology in that every field, says Bourdieu, has an inherent logic. It's that notion that Weber had of an inner lawfulness to a sphere coming from it, like the value you're trying to reach, or the good thing you're trying to maximize. And because there's that kind of inherent logic, Bourdieu assumes we can make a distinction between the people who are really oriented to the principles of that sphere and who care about how they're seen by others in that sphere, what Lang and Lang, two sociologists of culture, call recognition, right? And then there are those who will pander to outsiders, who want renown, who aren't necessarily seen as great by their competitors, but are popular, right? So the idea here would be that, for example, there are some artists who other artists think are great, even though they don't sell a lot of paintings. And then there's Thomas Kincaid, who I think is the best-selling artist, who's basically got a factory, churns out pretty landscapes, and is a laughing stock to professional artists. So that's his kind of choice. So that establishes homology to some extent, but that doesn't establish a clear homology to social space, except insofar that we have a difference between culture, since all of these are cultural fields, that's the autonomous thing, and that the heteronymous one is usually going to be associated with money. But actually it doesn't have to be. In some cases it might be a political power. Being, for example, the stooge of the government, being willing to put out the stuff that the Communist Party wants, and to rise in the ranks there, to be a good official ballet choreographer, as opposed to someone who's having a harder time getting their ballets put on because they're on the outs with the party, but are respected by other artists. So, yeah, it's tough. It's tough.
When I was working on my PhD in France, I was the only American he knew for about 5 years. I went to Christmas dinner with him. We had, I met continually with him and his top staff in terms of analyzing the data, how to do questionnaires. We did a survey questionnaires we did together. We did in the U.S. and France. We compared the data, so forth, replicating the NORC occupational prestige study, and to see if there were how big the differences were in status. And again, we found most were very similar here as in France. We both worked on universities, and he translated the key chapter of my thesis in his own terms, and published in the lead French journal. And I said, we must say, thank you to Pierre Bourdieu. I said, no, absolutely not. Privately, we got along very, very well. Publicly, CIA, foreign air, not nasty. So I said at one point,
that is, Bourdieu is criticizing Terry as one of the bad Americans, right?
Yes.
Which is you sort of have to do in France.
Yes.
So.
I said, why don't you, there are more sociologists in all over the U.S. than in the rest of the world by 10 times. Why don't you come to an American Sociological Association meetings here? Go to the U.S. The only reason I'd go to the U.S. would be to talk to Gary Becker, and he doesn't speak French, so I'm not going.
A Chicago economist, very much disliked by most sociologists, not personally, but his approach, getting a lot of hostility from the kind of people who love Bourdieu. The Americans love Bourdieu, hated Gary Becker.
But Bourdieu knew smart people were smart people, and Becker transformed the whole discipline of economics, moving and talking about not just about capital, but human capital. And then the idea of human capital, Bourdieu in turn extended that idea to cultural capital and to truck driver capital and so forth. So he could and did in the distinction as he get to the later works. And you mentioned I was at a conference with 20 people who would collaborate in different ways with Bourdieu, and often they would tell the same kind of stories, that among experts talking in a closed room, excellent to get along with, but we get to when he's on television, writing most of the books he writes for the general public, and therefore the people who really know the data on social mobility say, hey, this is ridiculous. His collaborator Passeron, for several books at the beginning, left Bourdieu, left Paris, and went to Avignon and Marseille, and developed a whole new approach focusing much more on multi-causality and on including popular culture. Bourdieu did not really talk explicitly about popular culture. What's the biggest in the world? It's not Brahms and Bourdieu, and the company, etc. It's Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and so forth. So they would study this in Avignon, but not by Bourdieu. So that is, one would the the explanation would be that there may be popular something which is popular, something in the minds of people who drink fat wine, but not really articulated or looked at. And so the concept, for instance, of omnivore, which you've heard, we'll talk about a little more, whatever, basically of having, you can be higher, you can listen, you can be a card-carrying visitor in subscription to the Chicago Symphony. And there's a survey by Northwestern of people who have tickets like this, ask the question, what music do you most often listen to on your radio? And number one was jazz and rock, not classical. Okay, that's the omnivore finding. And so the omnivore finding completely contradicts Bourdieu in that sense. Okay, so I'm giving you, I'm elaborating. There are two Bourdieus. They're the subtle and the simplistic, and learn from the best, as John has done with fields and with those things which are in the syllabus are commented on as the more subtle later works. Okay.
Easier?
Go ahead.
The question is actually a bit related to what Professor Clark was talking about. So I was wondering if you could talk more about how he made relationship between field and distinction, because distinction is more like consumption, while field is more about production. And while he has very like diverse subfields, which he argues will have their certain own logic, he has a single, very concise model for distinction, which he regards class as the most single important determinant of force. But I was wondering, like in some fields, like some cultural fields, those who do production will produce both the high cultural and those like working class consume. So I was wondering, like how we make relationship between these two concepts.
Yeah. So I think the thing that's been most difficult about grabbing Bourdieu is the change. What the younger Bourdieu is driven by this political outrage at the way in which culture is implicated in class reproduction, right? And the book with Passeron, Reproduction, is making the argument that while people assume that education is an engine of mobility, it's actually an engine of class reproduction, because people transmit to their children the cultural advantage they have that lets those kids excel in school, and then they're consecrated with a good job afterwards. So the reproduction is now indirect as opposed to direct. Instead of just giving your kid economic capital, you use your economic capital, get them to get cultural capital, give them cultural capital, then they can turn it back into economic capital. Bourdieu slowly drops that interest and becomes more and more interested in the cultural fields as he gets older and as he gets more control over the French educational establishment. And he becomes less and less critical of the sphere of education and more interested in defending the autonomy of the educational system against the evils of the business world, basically, and economy. So it's basically, he's continuing this sort of classic French fight of the people who want the state to support a secular education in the hands of the school people versus other forces, whether it's the church or big business. And Bourdieu, without realizing that he's actually flip-flopped, just changes his understanding of the nature of culture. He always loved culture, and he did write stuff on culture, in his middle period. But every year it got more and more further from the initial skepticism of the young Bourdieu, who would say no act is disinterested, and then the old Bourdieu is saying, like, no, there's the great painters, they're disinterested, and he doesn't see that there's a contradiction there. So I think the best thing is not to try to find that there is one system there, but to, like Terry's saying, take the parts that you think are smart. Minji, was it you?
I have another question about the nature of culture. So, like, although we're moving to the argument of culture omniverse, that's also very hierarchical way of seeing culture. You're participating in both culture, but that shows your status, upper status.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering, is there any comparable perspective that we see culture as like purely egalitarian, not hierarchical, where culture is just inherently hierarchical?
So first, maybe we should hold off some of this because not everyone has read we are going to read stuff about omnivores later, but I think the question about the hierarchy, so half of your question we should put on hold. So the question, but let's briefly talk about the ways in which people have attacked the hierarchical nature, because I think the problem, and we're going to have to put this, a lot of this on hold. We'll see things. The problem is that sociology as a discipline, we like hierarchy, and we can focus on the hierarchy, and we can make it seem like everything is just hierarchical, but no one really says that, right? All they mean is that's the part that we're interested in, because sociology is a science largely of stratification. So the parts that aren't that interesting, right? The fact that everybody likes SpongeBob or whatever, then it's neutral. Who cares? I don't know if that's true, but everybody likes sunset. So Pierre Bourdieu here, he tries to make a big deal of the fact that the upper class people think that their appreciation of sunsets is less than the working class people, that they're more likely to like a picture of a dead body on a stretcher or something. But the truth is, basically everyone likes sunsets, and nobody likes the dead stretcher picture that much, So there's a lot of non-hierarchy, but that's not what we in sociology get interested in. There are certainly still some Durkheimians who see culture as that which integrates us. And Jeffrey Alexander, when we get to him, we'll see that. Now, Terry's has a critique of Alexander that still he is hierarchical in that he has, like Bourdieu, a Paris province way of thinking. There's a center, and culture radiates from that center. It's a different kind of hierarchy. We will also see today the ways in which people see subcultures as potentially anti-hierarchical, but that's still not the same thing as completely non-hierarchical. I think the thing that would be the closest is actually the work that Terry just mentioned by Fleury, who is the sort of an anti-Bourdieuian Bourdieu, comes from that world, and starts saying, actually what we see is, we don't see Bourdieu's world, we see lots of places where culture is bringing people together. It is not reproducing class distinctions, it's doing the opposite. But to defend the Bourdieuian way of thinking, in some ways, especially given Durkheim, right? If culture is the thing that brings us together, that's not news, right? The news is when something that looks like it's not related to class domination turns out to be. And so even if it's not the dominant aspect of culture, it might be the one that's most sociologically significant.
A related point which fits with everything John said is that France and the world has changed since Bourdieu was young and Bourdieu got older, that there's been a huge increase in egalitarianism all around the world, from China to France to the U.S. So, but people who are a little older and who grew up in a slightly past period, in age cohorts you have conflicts which are substantial. So the president of France, at one point, they were concerned about the North African migrants to Paris and living outside of the center city we're burning down, we're burning cars, we're fighting with the police and so forth. So they wanted to do something to bring culture to the lower status, former communist voting areas. And so one day, the president of France, and the minister of culture announced, we will transfer the most traditional established theater and opera of Paris, the Comédie Française, to a small traditional communist suburb of Paris, and they didn't tell anybody in advance. So the next day, the mayor and the director of the little theater which they had, which was going to move the Comédie Française into the little theater, was there. They said, we weren't consulted. We don't want anything to do with this. We will hold public hearings, and we will kill what the president of France is telling us. And they won. The president lost, and the little town succeeded. So in that sense, these kinds of things, but I'm citing that as a practically, I mean, it was a stupid political move. It was defeated by the public and everyone around him. But my point is, Bourdieu was not alone. The president of France and Minister of Culture thought the same way, and they thought that, we're so high, we'll just tell them down there, and they lost. So egalitarianism drastically increased around the world with a big jump in 1968 and 1989 with the Tiananmen Square and the 68 Paris and Berkeley and Columbia disturbances.
Ijia?
Yeah. I was wondering, like, where does the hierarchy inside every field come from? His model seems to suggest that people have habitats and these are unconscious, but at the first time there's also this distinction between the tastes. So is that like consciously created by the domination group, or if that's the case, it seems to be contradictory with his argument.
Yeah, I have to say I really don't. I think that while he likes to abstractly describe that he has a single system, I don't see that. I see really different analytic approaches being used when he's looking at regular people in social space versus when he's looking at creative producers. He says, like, you need to think about habitus when it comes to field, but when he's actually analyzing a field, like a cultural field, he's not actually using those ideas. So if we take a cultural field, like the field of painting, for example, which was one that he knew a lot about, he cared a lot about, he's describing the hierarchy as emerging from competition, and competition that will be that's sort of inherent in any kind of production. So it's not just that in France there are both there are forms of consecration for painters that they're competing for, like to get in a certain exhibit, to get in the salon. But even for poetry, where there's no zero-sum nature of poetry, the assumption is that there's a competition and that people will always be ranked in some kind of differential esteem. So that's his assumption. I don't think he questions, and I don't know if there's any reason why we should question it, right? So the hierarchy comes because hierarchy always comes for someone, Bourdieu would say. The thing that I think is interesting about the Bourdieuian approach is his argument that actually there's always going to be two hierarchies. There's going to be a hierarchy of who gets the most money, and there's going to be a hierarchy of who has the most esteem from insiders. And those are going to be different, and there's going to be a tension there. That's the principle of homology that he makes such use of. And we've often assumed that it's true, but as Terry said, that kind of breaks down when you start looking at popular culture. It's really hard to say, Elvis sold out. He just went for the money. He didn't do rock and roll the way real rock and rollers do. And some people will say that, but people will always say stuff like that, right? Especially people who don't sell a lot of records. They'll say like, oh, I'm more pure. That's a good consolation story. But it's not obvious that there's actually a structuring principle of cultural fields. So one of the problems we have is that we have lots of cases where people give stories that we can interpret as being, as fitting that homology. But those are consolation stories. So the same person, like, oh yeah, I would never be in a major, I'm an actor. I'm not a movie star, and I would never do. Wait, that's the thing. Ring, ring. What? An Ivory soap commercial? How much does it pay? Sure, I'll take it. Like, oh yeah, where were we? Oh yeah, right. Like, so we have a real problem, which is that there are many cultural fields that involve public presentation that can confuse us as to the actual principles of ordering. Good field workers can get around that, but it takes a dedicated study with over time where you actually follow people over time and see where they come from and where they go. And there are all, and so I think, and Bourdieu's preface of distinction for the English edition, I think, is really good, where he basically says, look, the patterns here, you Americans are going to say, like, this is so French. I'm not saying the same patterns are going to hold here, but I am saying that you can use these principles to good effect no matter what. And a good example of this, there's in many cultural fields, there's an inversion where yes, the people, the people who have high recognition, who are liked by other field insiders, they're people that they like, who are in some ways at the top of that field. But if you ask the people at the top of the field who they like, they point to field outsiders. They say, oh, I'm not interested in art at all. Like, the best painters be like, oh, art? I hate art. I like paint. I only care about paint. I don't care about art. They're, the best chefs be like, what do you eat? Like, the best, it's street, it's like my grandmother's cooking. God bless her soul, since she died, street food. That's what I like. I like simple things. Now, that doesn't mean it's not a distinction strategy. It is, but at the top, to distinguish yourself from other top people, there's no one to identify with, so you go out. So there are things that might seem like they wreck the system, but they're not necessarily antithetical to the core principles that Bourdieu is using. They just don't translate well to the simplistic diagramming way that Bourdieu encourages us to sometimes think on that.
But I was thinking of the production of belief article, and also perhaps his work on Monday, where it takes a very sophisticated, someone who actually knows the rules and can excel at the rules of the game to subvert. For example, to say that I don't care about art, I don't care about what you guys care about in me, but I like some outsiders piece. It seems to take that sophistication to even do that. You have to really know the rules very well.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, I mean, he did a scholarly, very sophisticated, subtle book on Mauss, and then the Monet books, and other things. So he could do that, and he didn't try to impose a simplistic, dominating, and just in a heavy-handed way. So he clearly could and did do that. And I said the same kind of thing about Adorno. Adorno could be popular and simplistic and writing in the paper on Hollywood, but when you analyze what's good music, Strauss is a Nazi. Oh, it doesn't matter. Okay.
Young, you?
Yeah, I actually have more questions, because despite the distinction book, we have rule of arts and also some other writing by Bourdieu, by some kind of like knowing what we want, a reverse or something, other papers like that. I'm thinking like sometimes did Bourdieu actually simplify like the of like here is a pioneer art, and they say and he say like the audience number is actually reversed, like in this symbol in capital in that field is like less audience you have, you are more pioneer in this case. So I'm thinking like if this some kind of simplifying the idea of how production is, because I think in other place we also said like here is plot for culture production, and one kind of dimension is actually like the audience, whether it's more audience or less audience. So sometimes I think Bourdieu is trying to think about culture production from the perspective of cultural consumption. So I think it's also a question maybe for what Bourdieu is that I think Bourdieu is trying to connect with these two fields, but I think it's not a very good practice here or not. I'm thinking.
Yeah. That's when he's trying to simplify things, and he's saying things that just are not true, right? Like, you know, that your popularity is inversely correlated with your esteem, right? Like, it's, you know, it's true for some fields and it's not true for others, and it's true for some fields sometime, and then there's plenty of, you know. So I don't know who you think is the greatest. What's your favorite physicist? But for most of the world, it's Albert Einstein. And I've talked to physicists, they're like, oh yeah, he was really good. They're not like, oh, he's so pop. That's, you know, that's why he got so much attention, because he sold out, did the popular stuff. They're like, yeah, he's actually the best. So and it's just, yeah, it's not. When I think so I wanted to reserve a few minutes to talk about where we're going now with this, right? And so I think one thing was already came out, which is the issue of, is there a gradient of like lowbrow, medium-brow, highbrow taste that leads to the omnivorousness? But the other thing I think that people have been taking is trying to look at the dynamics more. Less, let's come up with, just make a description of a field, and more, are there interesting distinction dynamics, and are those still class related? And I think there is evidence that there are still these dynamics. It's just that they don't necessarily lead to uniform predictable patterns. They don't lead to homologies, the way Bourdieu went. Pierre?
I kind of forgot. No. Oh, but actually no. Yeah, two things. Like so it seems to me that he's bringing out like this phenomenology, right? Like the way that things feel is like really important to him, and like this whole like hexa thing too. But it seems to me like that hasn't, like maybe I'm wrong because I'm not in that field, but like it seems to me like that hasn't carried on as much in the sociology of culture, and I'm kind of just wondering how come, like, because it seems to me to be like quite an elegant almost combination of like this abstract symbols and structures and like the way that individuals feel about things and how that like plays with each other. But I feel like in general, like the phenomenology hasn't carried on as much into sociology of culture. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, we will actually, at the end of the quarter, we will be reading some of those who have pursued this. I think the simplest reason is that it's actually hard to write about. It's hard to put on paper. It's easy to put the reciprocal positions of people based on their careers on a chart, and it's hard to put the smell of something on the chart. So much Bourdieu. There's this part. I maybe it's in Being and Happiness, but there's a part where Sartre describes the inherent revulsion of like coming to Chicago and the way it stinks, right? Like. The beauty of that description, I think, is at Bourdieu's best. He's kind of reproducing that idea that there's this innate revulsion that people have, and it's very difficult. It's difficult to document that. It's difficult to describe it. It's difficult to put it on paper in a way that is believable to people, because we don't have a good way of measuring it. We can measure tones, and we can make frequency distributions. You can reproduce art, but these other kinds of experiences, we don't have a notation for them, so we don't really know how to write about them. It's a serious problem, especially when it comes to, as we'll see, We're going to read a great piece on scent, which has been basically not studied by sociologists of culture at all. Really don't have a good vocabulary. There is perfume makers have a vocabulary for it, but I really it's not just my fondness, as so Terry's teasing me for being a Berkeley hippie. It's not just my fondness for the early Bourdieu because he's socking it to the man. It's that I think there's something really deep, really smart, and really unsystematizable in this. Precisely, it's about like. Yeah, the phenomenological experience, what it's like to taste something and be like, oh my God, like only a peasant would drink this. And I just have to tell you, so yeah, Bourdieu, his dad was a postman, but they were from peasant stock. They were provincial. And Bourdieu was always, he went to this great school, but he would tell Terry, he's like, Terry, I went to that school, but look at your hands, look at my hands. My hands look like I should be pushing a plow. He had big, thick fingers, and he's like, do you know how hard it was to be taken seriously at that lycée? With my hands, they'd be like, who's got it? Like, raise your hand if you have an answer. Like, we're not calling on that hand. We're not calling on the plowman's hand. You know, yeah, I thought there was something really deep about that, and increasingly it gets replaced by this more formulaic stuff. And so Terry's saying the book on Manet is I don't think it's that subtle. I think it's crude in the sense that he's got like there's some people who are good and some people are bad. Manet is like me. He's good. He's doing things. He's pure. He's doing things that he's following the logic of painting, and his opponents are not. But the opponents, like he even quotes Manet's critic Delacluse, who's like, the thing about Manet is that he's totally selling out. He's so interested in popular acclaim that he's painting stuff that's trashy, right? And Manet would say, no, like painting is about how you do it. It's not about the composition. So if I paint a prostitute, and I do it beautifully, that's even more important than if I were to paint some like Greek scene of gods. And Delacluse would be like, no, composition is the heart of painting. What you choose to paint about, that's the most important thing. So they just disagreed, but Bourdieu's got this kind of like increasingly doctrinaire way of thinking that removes it from that phenomenological sense. But oh shoot, I went into Terry's time. Let's take our break and then talk about subcultures. Oh, yeah. Okay, so we'll come back at 5:03. 5:03. Yeah.
Good discussion.
Yeah.
Berkeley hippie. Self-labeled. There we go. Pull the shirt out.
Yeah,
there we go.
Exactly. I tried to fit in.
No, well.
Yeah, but
we couldn't disagree on practically anything today.
So it is funny, because I've become more and more critical of Bourdieu, or you agree more about some of this stuff, but I've also become more appreciative of the earlier stuff, including reproduction, which it's a gestalt shift, right? And it is the same thing of saying, like, you thought it was half full, but I'm going to tell you it's half empty. But at the same time, I think it really opened up the field of sociology of education in really important ways.
Good discussions. And the reason I kept talking to him was that he knew he had wonderful little examples, and he read women's style magazines, and he would quote from them in a subtle way, and he knew about. He did ethnographic kind of personal observation, and he did more of that. He was in the system in ways that I was not.
Right, as you said last time, Simon, in my notes, Bourdieu was unusual in that he knew how to talk to magazine audiences, and he would talk to Elle, and and reach that audience, taking them seriously.
You really know everyone. You were
That's all of the history of sociology and culture.
Where there were smart people to learn from.